Social justice means applying the law equally to all people, but in practice, that doesn't always happen. I'm John Gonzalez. I'm here with my former law partner, Jack DeRora. We practice law, we seek social justice. On this show, we reveal the conflict between the two.
You know, for a while, it was just us in the office over a cup of coffee talking about the news of the day. With social justice issues dominating our culture, our focus became how do we, as lawyers, make a difference?
And now it's not just us. Today we have back with us Dr. Laura Dugan, one of the nation's top terrorism scholars and co-founder of the Global Terrorism Database. Few people understand the path from 9/11 to January 6th more clearly than she does. Welcome, Dr. Dugan.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Well, interestingly enough, Jack, the January 6th tourists were in the news again just because of this slush fund money that the settlement of Trump's IRS lawsuit was supposed to give them. And I'm not sure why they think they're getting this money, but a lot of them were lining up for it. And I guess it just goes to underscore our topic today about where do these people come from and how did it get so bad that on January 6th they were allowed to attack the Capitol and now possibly get paid for doing so?
Well, the possibility of getting paid, I think, went out the window just yesterday or the day before when Todd Blanche said, oh, we're taking that off the table. Although he probably had his fingers crossed when he said that.
I was going to say, you believe anything that's,
no.
Yeah, my thought is that it's kind of like retreat a little bit and see if there's another avenue to do this. But where is our country going when our government is thinking about compensating people that would actually try to interfere with the smooth functioning of our government?
Great question. All I know is that there is an element on the far right that doesn't get enough notoriety, even though January 6th was a big deal. That group isn't in the news as much as I think it should be.
Dr. Dugan, last time you were here with us, we were talking, I think it was off air, about your study, and you sent us an article, if I got the title right, Far Right and Jihad Terrorism Within the United States from September 11th to January 6th.
Yes.
And let me let you summarize that article, so I'll probably won't do it justice, but it's kind of a scary thought that what we see on January 11th is something that our government created years before.
January 6th.
January 6th, excuse me.
It's all right.
Yeah. Well, let me say that, the title was very provocative. It does not in any way argue that the government intentionally set the stage so that something like January 6th would happen. What the article does is it talks about deterrence theory, which is a very, very old theory from the 1700s. Caesarea Beccaria wrote a really great book on crime and punishment, and it's the basis of our U.S. criminal justice system. And so this idea of deterrence is really important. And the principles that he speaks about are, among a lot of other things, proportionality is one of the keys. And so what my colleague Darren Fisher and I argue in the article that you read is that the U.S. government misused deterrence in a way that invoked backlash. It was disproportionately harsh toward, I would say, what I argue in the paper, what we argue in the paper is disproportionately harsh toward Muslims and those of Arab descent, and but also disproportionately lenient toward those who are fighting against Muslims. In fact, there was the response to September 11th I would not necessarily say George W. Bush, but John Ashcroft explicitly made a call for Americans to look for terrorists in their neighborhoods. And he detained thousands and thousands of Arabs and Muslims, none of which were ever found to be involved with terrorism of any kind. But he kept them for a long time. Hate crimes against Muslims and Arabs rose dramatically. The disproportionate harshness that I speak of was basically the war on terror.
The confinement that you wrote about, was news to me. And I recall, and I don't know if I recall it when it happened or I recall it because more recently people were comparing the way Bush talked about Muslims after the 9/11 attacks and tried to calm people's fears and did things like that. So it was a little bit surprising to me that this is where this deterrence started under the Bush administration, even though on the outside, what I remember is he was trying to say, hey, look, Muslims are great people. These are, the people that caused 9/11 are an offshoot or, an aberration. Let's not go crazy. But you're saying the administration was actually treating it differently?
John Ashcroft was, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. And I do remember all of the detainments and people disappearing, thousands and thousands of men mostly disappearing on the streets and families not being able to reach them. And it was in the news, but it may not have gotten enough attention for you to notice or for you to remember. And I would actually say that this struggle to remember these types of details is part of the problem. To continue with the theme of the article, while we say that we there's lots of evidence that disproportionately severe efforts at deterrence are going to bring about more violence. And we see that with the war on terror throughout the world. That just led to more and more the rise of ISIS, ISIL, and it affected every nation pretty much. And so we see that. But the other part that we speak of in this article is when we use disproportionate leniency toward a group. In fact, Beccaria says that that's perhaps even more dangerous than disproportional severity. And by disproportionate leniency, what I'm saying is that when we don't punish people for the bad behavior they do, and what we describe there is how violence by white people that by any other definition would be called terrorism by anyone else. In fact, there's been research that shows using experimental data with scenarios where if you show the same event and in some of them it's a Muslim associated with a jihadi group, and the others it's a white person associated with a white supremacist group, and you show them the same thing. The respondents are much less likely to call the event terrorism if it was the white perpetrator. And so we have in this nation, we have a blind eye to the behavior of white people when they do things that meet the definition of terrorism.
That was going to be my question. What when we talk about terrorism, I guess what makes an event terrorism that fits into your analysis?
So there are a lot of different definitions of terrorism. And in the article, what I basically do is just take the basic, what items are found in almost every definition of terrorism. And it's ideologically motivated an event for a political reason.
Okay.
And so, in fact, we argue that what happened on January 6th was a terrorist attack, not that everybody that engaged in what happened on January 6th were terrorists, and not what everyone did was a terrorist attack, but there's strong evidence, it's undisputed, found in the legal courts that this was planned well in advance. There were groups of men mostly, but who brought weapons and planned to infiltrate the Capitol and stop the actions of those days, the certification of Joe Biden as the next president. And that is very explicitly what we would call any definition a terrorist attack. So using violence or the threat of violence to influence a policy is terrorism. And so I don't think that those people who were inspired by the actions of others, or perhaps President Trump's speech that day, who ran down to the Capitol to protest and saw people breaching it and jumped in and got involved in that, they were not engaging in terrorism. They were rioting. They were just caught up in the flow. But there were people there who very intentionally, in fact, probably were planning on using the protesters as an army, as additional members of their armies to stop the certification.
So they were unwitting pawns, I suppose.
Yeah.
And, you mentioned the big picture and it being orchestrated by people who weren't necessarily there. And you're probably referring to people, I think, like, what's his name, Stuart Rhodes? Is that the one? And Enrico Tarrio?
Yeah, absolutely.
They weren't there, but they each were sentenced to close to 20. I think it's Rhodes, that's his name, but they were each sentenced to close to 20 years until our dear leader pardoned them.
I have I think, a basic understanding of jihad terrorists. You use that term, jihad terrorism, and how, as you say, could be ideologically motivated through their religious beliefs. What I struggle with a little bit is the far-right terrorists, the far-right terrorism. What is the ideology that's motivating the far-right terrorists?
Well, those that we refer to as the far right follow lots of different belief systems, right? So there's not a one size fits all, but the general idea. I actually was just trying to come up with a definition of what far right terrorism is, and what I would say it is that there's these are people who experience an existential threat, and from an outgroup. And that outgroup needs to be destroyed in order for survival. And so it's very much us against them. And so you can look at different sub-ideologies. And so the anti-government, so a lot of what was happening on January 6th is this war against the U.S. government that has been brewing amongst the far right for decades. And so here's an opportunity. First of all, there's a leader who's espousing a lot of these beliefs that they have, right? The us against them, this us Americans and the Muslims. It's this existential threat, and he's standing up there. The murderers and the rapists from Mexico. Again, this othering. And so he's espousing a lot of the things that the KKK espouses. And they're hearing it, and they're responding to it. And so here is somebody who's in the White House who's then saying that there was a corrupt election, that he's going to have to leave unless we do something, that our democracy is at stake. The truth is finally risen, and I'm leading this country in the way it should be led. But corrupt Joe Biden and the Democrats stole the election unless we do something. And so that far right, this existential threat, and this desire of decades for a war, an all-out war, is what led to January 6th. I mean, I knew something like January 6th was going to happen. I didn't know when. I mean, it became obvious because that was the last chance that it would happen. But I think the reason it didn't happen sooner is because Trump kept fighting, kept having lawsuits against the election. And so there was no set time because we were waiting for lawsuits to play out. But had there not been lawsuits, there most likely would have been severe violence right after the election. Had Joe Biden been declared much sooner.
You said something very interesting, that this notion of othering, the government being at risk, et cetera, of the far right had been brewing, you said, for decades.
Yes.
Talk about the historical roots. That's really interesting.
Yeah. So there's a really great book by Catherine Ballou. I believe it's called The War Coming Home, but it's definitely Kathleen Ballou if you want to look it up, where she talks about, she goes a lot further back, but more recently, around the time of Vietnam, the KKK experienced a resurgency from Vietnam vets who were very, very just disturbed by the U.S. government and what it had done, and so they were planning on they just wanted to abolish. And again, I'm not speaking about all veterans, but this resurgence of the KKK were preparing for a war against the U.S. government because it needed to go. They were very disappointed, and over the years with this resurgence, they started working with other groups who had other issues against the U.S. government. So this includes anti-abortion groups in the 70s. And so, after Roe v. Wade and neo-Nazis, and a lot of these were sort of doing they would be training together, but they all had this idea of a war against governments. Now, a lot of them were also very much invested in a race war. So, with this idea of this is going to be a white nation and others can go to other parts, or separatist ideals where this portion is for all the white people and black people can go here. Jews for sure go to Israel. That's for you, and so forth. And so these ideas have been brewing for a long time. And I'd say that it all came ahead in 1995 with Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City. And so that was all from this, this whole brewing. I mentioned in the article that you read a book that was found on Timothy McVeigh's truck, the Turner Diaries, which describes this sort of phenomena of this war against the U.S. government and the preparation for it, and this is why he attacked the federal building. But this was also a period where suddenly everybody's looking at the far right, and so they sort of went underground. But they weren't very much underground prior to that. In fact, if you recall, I know I'm asking you to go back much further than September 11th, but if you recall in 1995, when the Murrow building was attacked, right? The news was all the White House. Everybody was speculating that these were Islamic terrorists, right? Mm-hmm. That it was all about that, but it came from within. Like, that was not the first place we looked. It must be the brown-skinned bad people who are after us. And to be fair, we were involved in a lot of different things in the 90s that would actually have angered, Islamic terrorists. But it came from within, obviously. And while Timothy McVeigh worked with just he and his friend, it was part of a larger movement. And so but things subsided after that, and they basically went underground / online, and so it didn't go away.
Your analysis relies upon data that you collected through the Global Terrorism Database.
Yes,
and so that collected data both on the jihadists worldwide and on what's going on in this country with the far right.
Yeah, the database is actually much bigger than what you saw in that article.
Okay.
We well, first of all, a colleague of mine, Gary Lafree, and I were given access to a bunch of index cards. This is in 2001. A former student of my colleagues worked at Pinkerton, and they had been collecting incidents of global terrorism for a long time in order to provide security to their clients, right? So and after 9/11 happened, they're like, well, this might be of value to somebody. And so they gave it to us. And we got a grant from the National Institute of Justice to computerize it. And so the original data set started in 1970 and went through 1997. And so we computerized it and we found other sources and supplemented it, and we called it the Global Terrorism Database. And then we hired some people to continue collecting it retrospectively up to a point, and then prospectively, meaning that they would look for past events, because this was 2005 by the time that we hired them. And so they needed to fill in incidents from 1998 to the present. And then we got caught up with the present, and it continued actually. The collection actually stopped in June of 2021. I left the University of Maryland and came here in 2021. It didn't stop because of me, but there were issues around funding and various things that the center that was running it could not continue it anymore. But it has those. So those data are global data on both domestic and international terrorism, and it has a very broad definition of what terrorism is, so that scholars and people who look at it can filter out things that they don't consider terrorism. Because as I had mentioned earlier, the definition is there are a lot of different definitions. And so, for instance, I have colleagues who feel like if the target is military, that's not terrorism. That's legitimate warfare, even if they're off duty. And so there were attacks that happened at, for instance, a very famous one at a discotheque in Beirut, Lebanon in the 80s. I don't expect you to remember that, but I've looked at it and studied it, and so some people won't call that terrorism, but most people do, because these were people that were off duty, that they had the U.S. military were targeted, but the database allows that to be filtered out.
Are you saying there's no successor to this database after 2021? So
far, no.
Ooh.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out ways to continue it. It takes a lot of resources, and it was funded first by the Department of Homeland Security, and then by the State Department. And then when the State Department, I think it was like 2019, they went with a different group, which I don't know if that group even continued. Then START was basically funding it itself, but also having different users pay for access. And so access to scholars was still free, and different governments were free, but those who wanted to use it for other purposes had to pay for it. But that model didn't seem to continue to work. And so it hasn't. So yeah, they stopped collecting it. There were efforts to collect it just in the United States for a bit, and that still may be going on. But for now, it doesn't. There is no alternative that I know of.
If I can do this in simple terms, what your database was showing you is that as the jihad terrorism events, maybe because of the crackdown or the deterrence efforts were less, the far-right terrorism events grew over that time?
Actually, I can't say. So I'll say it a little bit differently. What we see is that there were far more far-right events over that period, and even before. I actually show the 90s as well, and you can see there was far more far-right affecting Americans than there was jihadi. I wouldn't necessarily say that jihadi declined, because it was never high to begin with, except for September 11th. There were attacks overseas, which even I looked at the overseas data where Americans were targeted, and there were still more far-right attacks directed in the United States than there were jihadi against any American anywhere in the world.
So the correlation then, maybe I was misunderstanding. It's not that we put all these resources into the jihadi attacks and that allowed far right terrorism to grow. They almost sound like maybe two separate phenomenons. That there aren't a lot of jihad attacks, even though our government puts a lot of resources into preventing it. But there are a lot of far-right terrorism attacks that our government isn't putting a lot of effort into.
Yes.
Okay. I know I'm simplifying a lot of research a lot of time.
Simple is good.
Okay. I understand. So
I do argue a link, though.
Okay.
Because the government is also signaling through its hostility toward Muslims and jihadi terrorism, Islamic terrorism, and the existential threat language it uses. It's in a way emboldening people to go against Muslims. Mm-hmm. And so I show the dramatic rise in hate crimes that occurred on 9/11 and never went back down to the levels prior to 9/11, that have risen since that stabilized and then rose again in the mid-2010s and have continued to rise. That is so this disproportionality has, in a way, emboldened the far right. What we saw even years before Donald Trump was running for president, what we saw is a mainstreaming of fringe anti-Muslim organizations that were being used to provide advice to government agencies that in the past were not taken that seriously. And so there was a really great study that I cite in the article that did a network analysis of these different fringe groups and how they moved to more central positions afterwards. The terrorism experts that were being called to speak were coming from these anti-Muslim organizations. And so the shift of rhetoric and this idea of an existential threat that occurred because of September 11th is in a way what created such a change for us that normalized a lot of things that we never would have thought were normal prior to that gave permission, and I would have air quotes, permission for these far-right groups or people with far-right ideology to act out and do things and not be seen as doing bad things.
I follow you on the government's influence of kind of the anti-Muslim sentiment. I mean, I think what you lay out is pretty clear cut. I'm curious, though, as to how much more social media played into it, because government has so little control over social media, and once something's picked up, I mean, you take the Springfield stuff of the eating the cats and dogs.
Oh yeah, good point.
What a ridiculous thing that just spread, because of social media. I mean, if we were back in the 80s or before, people outside of maybe Springfield would have no idea that was going on. But do you factor in social media into your analysis?
I don't, but I talk about it. Mm-hmm. I mean, just because it's hard to have measures of this sort of thing. Although, as an aside, I have access to data on social media and have been doing research on it because it is so important. So yes, I agree. Social media for sure. What it does is it facilitates the spread of these ideas in a much faster way. And so, when I had said that after the 1995 attacks in Oklahoma City, the far right went underground and / online. And in fact, there's this new alt tech that, it was new back then, that became very, very active. I have a postdoc, Adam Burston, if you're listening. He is studying actually he is here doing a postdoc at The Ohio State, studying the advent of far-right groups on far right ideologies on the internet, and so he's been looking at these bulletin boards that were started by these far right actors who. Tech geeks, and it's been really fascinating to see they're coming together and talking to like-minded people finally in ways that they didn't have access before. And so we're looking at the history and the growth of these communities. And so yes, it has been facilitated more. You mentioned social media, which is more recent than the internet, but on top of that, then you have these the algorithms that repeat exposure to things that you click on, or even slow down to read. So yeah, this is all part of the problem, and so what we don't get is exposure to ideas that are counter to what we believe to make us stop and think more critically, and that is a problem.
Well, I'm not, in a way, I'm not surprised because I think we are, or a number of people are naturally inclined not to see the threat that you talk about because it's white Americans doing something, and that we just have this blind spot, it seems to me. But that's my comment. Here's my question. Are you seeing a difference over the years in how the FBI tracks terrorist groups, whether they're anti-jihadist whether they're jihadist groups or alt-right groups?
That is a very interesting question. So I don't have privy to what the FBI is doing. What I can say is what the Department of Homeland Security has been really focusing on countering violent extremism, and this focus has been very strong, very well funded, and they've been doing really great work for a long time. When Donald Trump became president, he changed the countering violent extremism initiative to countering Islamic extremism. So I would guess that during that, this is the first Trump administration, and so I'm guessing during that period that they didn't see far right much at all. And then after that, I have colleagues who are involved in the Department of Homeland Security, and they talked about, and I actually see the value of this, that their focus over the years, post-Trump, under the Biden administration, is to avoid ideology altogether and look at the behavior. And so, and it's not that it's. So I think that what they're trying to do is take a more ideological neutral approach and to investigating these things and to providing some sort of counterterrorism initiative there. Now, I don't necessarily think that's super wise, only because by understanding the grievances of different people, we learn about their vulnerabilities, and that we can understand what it. I'm very much into prevention, right? And so if we understand what's upsetting people, perhaps we can help them. Perhaps we can get to them before they turn to violence. And so by only looking at behavior, I don't think we deal with root causes. It's more about just assuming that there are bad people out there, and let's just protect things from bad people. Whereas I think that, for instance, different groups are very vulnerable to being recruited by extremists. And if we understand those recruitment strategies, therefore we can perhaps protect the people that are more vulnerable to being recruited by directing different types of programs toward them. And I'm not to say that DHS isn't doing that. I'm sure they are. But I think ideology is pretty useful.
Back to your point, Jack, I was kind of wrapping my head around why we give the white nationalists, the far-right people, more of a pass ideology-wise. I think it goes back to it's kind of a common U.S. citizen experience to distrust our government. I mean, I think, and this is just me saying this, I don't have any data to back it up, but people distrust our government for a number of reasons, and they always have. It's always been a topic of conversation. And so I think when you then get these extremists, these conspiracy theories, some people give them a pass on their ideology because there's this common thread that we all have. And I don't see it with the Muslim. And my guess is because I don't understand the Muslim religion. I've never studied it. I hear about it. But if there's negativity, I don't have anything to back it up in my own common experience with other people. So I think it's almost easier for us to say, yeah, that Muslim person is motivated by ideology, where that white person, from Toledo, I'm trying to think, Steubenville, excuse me, is not. And I don't know if that goes anywhere, but I tend to agree with you that understanding the grievance, the ideology, is important to trying to stop it.
Yes.
Or trying to deal with it. What should our government have learned? Did you get to a point where, hey, here's the blueprint to do things right as we move forward?
I put out suggestions, and in fact, actually, the Divided Communities Project here at Ohio State is work with the Mershon Center, which is part of where I work, is putting out a message to political leaders about how to reduce the risk of political violence. And I'll tell you, I'm putting a pin in that because to answer your question, it'll end up there among other places. But what we suggest in the paper is to focus on the proportionality of a response to an event, right? And so instead of when something happens, instead of turning it into an existential threat, and I am not saying that what happened on September 11th wasn't devastating. It absolutely was. And I agree that President George W. Bush was working hard to try to right-size it after the cat went out of the bag, by telling people that those who attacked us on September 11th were not representative of Islamic faith. But it did fall on deaf ears, and his entire administration was not behind that message for sure, but particularly by the actions that they were taking. Also, the way that we give white people a slide is a problem. Mm-hmm. And so by treating those who commit the same act the same way legally is a first step for sure. Avoiding this villainizing of and othering and dehumanizing of offenders is pretty important. And this gets at this statement or this list of actions that political leaders can take that the Divided Community Projects and the Mershon Center of International Security Studies is working on. Is it gives messages to political leaders that say, how do we reduce the risk of political violence? And it says, avoid this type of language. Avoid speaking of opponents as if they are not human. And then it try to include those who don't agree with you in the conversations. I mean, this may ring back to a period of time a long time ago when people who had different opinions would have civil conversations. But this is what we need. And our leaders need to model that so that we can start talking to each other in a way that we can see each other and hear other people's ideas and not think that they're evil just because they voted for somebody that we think is not a very good person to be in office.
Let me see. I want to know if I've captured your thought correctly. 9/11, as horrible as it was with the loss of 3,000 people, give or take, it really wasn't an existential threat to the U.S. It presented a grave danger, but it wasn't existential. But it somehow was treated as being an existential threat in which all Muslims were regarded as terrorists. And that just, I guess what you're saying, for lack of a better phrase, inflames the nation and leads to bad decision-making and bad policy. Have I got that right?
Yes.
Okay. It's interesting. Let me just go off topic just a bit. You talked about Ashcroft, I guess, incarcerating some large number of Muslims for some period of time. And you didn't say it, but I think the implicit message is they were never tried or convicted.
Correct.
And then on top of that, I just looked this up the other day, we incarcerated some close to 800 people in Gitmo Bay. And I think there are 30 left. We released the rest of them. What a tremendous abuse of power. And, we're not remembering that, how badly we acted. That was beyond the pale. And I guess what you're saying, that's an outgrowth of this tremendous excitement. I don't mean that in a positive way, but excitement and anxiety over the threat of jihadism that just led to some bad policy. And you're now saying gave the alt-right like implicit permission to act badly.
Yes.
I think to add to that, we're kind of caught up in our own worldview bubbles for a lot of reasons, both from the algorithms we talk about with social media and the internet and the political parties. And it really is hard to have a conversation with somebody who's in a different bubble. To me, it's been harder and harder. And what's disappointing is that we're not collecting this important data, because it seems to me, if you think about the last 20 years, it's kind of cascading and it's getting worse. And the data now has to be fabulous. I say that not in a great way, but there's got to be very, very good data and a lot easier to mine it. So it's disappointing because you need the data first, then you need to analyze it to understand it, to even get moving forward on a solution. Does it really worry you that there's nobody out there that can fund this type of effort?
I am very worried about it. I'm very worried about it. I mean, prior to us collecting and making public the global terrorism database, the only measures of terrorism were international terrorism attacks that crossed national borders. And it's about 7-1 what's domestic versus international. I also think that there are entities out there that do not want the data to be collected. And so we have seen efforts to sabotage data collection all over the place, and for the reasons that different databases. Let me back up so I see your confusion. As a researcher, databases that have been publicly available to us have gone away. That measure various things. And there's been censoring of different databases. So any database that mentions women or LGBTQ or things here in the United States have been suppressed, or they've been altered in a way to change them. And so I think that there are those out there that don't want us to be measuring these things for their own political reasons. And the beauty of the global terrorism database is that it was beholden to nobody. Even though we were funded by the Department of Homeland Security, we were a center of excellence at the University of Maryland, and nobody could come in and tell us what to include and not include. We did get a call in the mid-2000s from the Bush administration asking us to remove all of the attacks against abortion clinics from the data. And we just laughed. I mean, it was it's true. They didn't think those were actually terrorist attacks, and so and it felt good to be able to say no because we were not beholden to them. So governments collecting the data is not a good idea. What we need are private entities doing it. Now, there are other efforts where you can glean terrorism from them. ACLID, which is a database that looks at political conflict situations, that's collected globally, but the effort to translate those data into what matches the definition of terrorism would take a huge amount of resources and efforts.
I'm going to ask you to do something that Gonzo and I would never ask a client to do. As lawyers, we would never ask a client to do. But why don't you speculate on who you think these political forces are who aren't too interested in the terrorist and data and analysis?
Oh, okay. Well, I would say that I'm going to be general because I don't want to be targeted, but I would say I've talked about so far this implicit tendency of those of us here in the United States to not see white people as villains, right? I think that there's an explicit effort by some in our government to not see those white people as villains. In fact, I can be very explicit in saying that our current president pardoned everybody who was involved in what happened on January 6th and is treating them as if they were prisoners of war, as they were the victims of what had happened. You had started this podcast out by talking about that. And so to have a nonpartisan terrorist incident database that just looks at the actions, because that's how it was collected. We have a definition of terrorism, it's behavior. We're not saying those that do it are terrorists, although when we write about it, we say those who engage in acts of terrorism are terrorists, but we're not like going into who their character is. But we're calling, we have recorded incidents by everyone. We got a call from, this was a number of years ago, from a minister who has a congregation whose name was in our database. And he contacted our data manager at the time and asked that his name be removed. And she said no, because he had some explaining to do. Now, those incidents include people who are on the left, those who are on the right, those who are involved in various things. But if they do an act that is that, and so what I'm saying is that I do think that there was a distinct effort, and I don't know for sure, but there are signs that point to an effort to not have our database published and available to everybody because it doesn't make everyone look good.
Shocking.
I am optimistic in thinking that the pendulum swings, then it'll swing back, and we're all just kind of waiting out our current administration so that things could get back to normal and maybe even go a little bit better for what you're interested in, which is the databases and the data mining. So I truly hope that that's the case after a couple of years. But thank you for coming in and talking with us about it.
Sure.
Very interesting stuff.
Thank you.
It's a depressing but interesting and important subject. So thank you for being with us. It was very good. Our thanks to WOSU and our sound engineer, Dalton Jones. If you like what you've heard, tell a friend. We want this to be more than just us. We want it to be all of us. Like us, follow us, submit a review, help elevate our profile so that other podcast listeners can find us. We'll be back in another week or so with another important social justice issue. Until then, so long.